John Griffin sat in his living room, the soft glow of the TV illuminating the room, but his mind was elsewhere. His wife, Linda, had left that morning for a business meeting in Florida. John had never been the overly jealous type, trusting Linda completely with her work trips. But tonight, something felt off, and he couldn't shake the feeling. His phone rang, breaking his thoughts. It was Carl, his older brother. John picked it up, trying to sound casual. "Hey, Carl. What's up?" Carl Griffin was once a name that struck fear into anyone who heard it. A notorious gangster with a reputation for brutality, he ruled the streets with an iron fist. His enemies often disappeared without a trace, and those who crossed him paid in ways that sent a chilling message to everyone else. Known for his calculated ruthlessness, Carl wasn't just feared. He was respected in the underworld, a man whose word was law and whose actions were swift and merciless. Despite his dark reputation, Carl had always been fiercely loyal to his family, especially to his younger brother, John. It was John who had pleaded with Carl to leave his violent life behind and chart a new path, not just for himself, but for the sake of the boys who idolized their uncle. Reluctantly, Carl agreed, stepping away from the life of blood and power to find peace in the shadows of reform. "Not much, bro." Carl's voice was low, almost cryptic. "Just wanted to give you a heads up about something." John furrowed his brow. "A heads up? About what?" "I've been watching Linda," Carl said nonchalantly. "I know she's in Florida for the meeting, but I've seen something kind of disturbing." John's stomach dropped. "What the hell are you talking about?" "I saw her," Carl continued, his voice steady but with an edge of something John couldn't quite place. "She's not just in Florida. She's with someone else. A man." John's heart pounded in his chest. His mind raced, trying to make sense of the words. "What? Are you serious? Who is this guy? Are you sure?" "I'm sure, man," Carl responded, his tone unwavering. "I've been keeping an eye on her. I know what I saw. She's kissing him." A silence filled the air. John could barely catch his breath. His trust, his entire sense of security with Linda, felt like it was crumbling in an instant. "No," John muttered, his voice trembling slightly. "This isn't right. You've got to be mistaken. Where's this coming from? What are you talking about?" Carl's voice was cold now, a little more distant. "I'm not mistaken. I've got proof." "Proof?" John repeated, his mind spinning. "How the hell do you have proof?" A few moments passed before John heard the sound of a message notification. His phone buzzed. "Check your messages," Carl said, his voice sharp. John glanced down at his phone, fingers trembling as he unlocked it. He saw a series of pictures and then a video file, all attached to Carl's message. His breath caught in his throat as he clicked on the first image. There was Linda, unmistakable even in the dim light of the image, her lips locked with another man, her eyes closed in the passion of the kiss. John's mind went blank, his world tilting. He scrolled to the next image. Same man, same kiss. His hands shook. He opened the video next, watching the scene unfold in front of him. It was clear now. Linda was in a hotel lobby, the man by her side, smiling as they embraced. She kissed him again, her hands tangled in his hair, the man's hand inside her pants on her hips. Another video showed them in a car having sex. John felt sick, his stomach churning as he watched the betrayal unfold on his screen. "This can't be real," he whispered, his voice barely audible as he stared at the evidence. His heart was breaking, and the overwhelming sensation of disbelief clawed at him. "Why would she?" Carl interrupted him, his voice harsher now, almost amused. "I told you, John. I'm just letting you know what's going on. You're lucky I caught this." "Lucky?" John's voice raised, a mix of anger and confusion. "What the hell, Carl? What do you want me to do with this? Why didn't you call me earlier?" "I wanted to make sure you had all the facts," Carl replied bluntly. "She's playing you, bro. I thought you should know." John closed his eyes, trying to steady his breath, but the images wouldn't leave his mind. This wasn't just a fleeting moment. It was real. His wife, the woman he loved and trusted, was with another man, and Carl had caught it. John leaned back in his chair, his hand gripping the phone so tightly his knuckles turned white. His thoughts spiraled out of control. He had questions, but the answers eluded him. Why had she done this? Was this the first time? Had he missed the signs? John sat there, staring at the screen of his phone, the images and video of Linda in another man's arms burning into his memory. His mind was a storm of emotions: anger, hurt, confusion. The phone buzzed again. It was Carl. "Hey," John answered, his voice a bit strained from the whirlwind of his thoughts. "I'm not gonna lie, John," Carl said, his voice steady but carrying an edge, like he was speaking from experience. I told you what I saw, and I'm telling you now, you need to hire a PI. I can get you one, no problem. You need proof, man. Get it on record, and you can divorce her. I know this shit is rough, but it's the smart way to go. John sat back, processing Carl's words. His brother had been through a lot in his life, and his advice, while blunt, had an odd sense of truth to it. Still, the idea of hiring a private investigator felt like he was stepping into a world he didn't belong in. What do you mean, a PI? John's voice was thick with disbelief. I don't even know where to start. What if I make things worse? Carl let out a low laugh. You think this is bad? It can get worse, John. A hell of a lot worse. You want to go off half-cocked and confront her without real proof? You'll just look like a fool. Plus, if she's as deep in this as I think she is, you'll never get the full story unless you've got hard evidence. That's how this game works. John's thoughts raced. Carl was right about one thing. Confronting Linda without the full truth wouldn't end well. It would just create more confusion and heartbreak. But hiring a PI? That felt like a step into some darker territory. But, Carl, you know I've never been the kind of guy to go down that road. I don't want to make this worse than it already is. Carl's tone hardened, the protective older brother now fully in control of the conversation. Listen to me, John. You don't have the luxury of playing nice anymore. If you want out of this with your dignity intact and your future secure, you need evidence. The PI will get you that. The cops will be able to track everything down later. You don't want to just swing at her without knowing what's really going on. I'm telling you, take the logical route. Find out what she's been doing, get the proof, and move on. John gritted his teeth. The last thing he wanted was to get caught in a spiral of revenge and hurt, but Carl was pushing him toward practicality. In his gut, John knew that if he didn't take action now, he would regret it later. And if I don't do this? John asked, his voice quiet, almost uncertain. Carl's voice dropped, almost conspiratorial. If you don't do this, you'll be blind, John. You'll be reacting based on emotions, and that never works out in the long run. But worse, you'll have no leverage when it comes to the divorce. No leverage means she can walk all over you. Trust me, I've seen it before. John felt a lump in his throat, his mind struggling to reconcile everything. He had never thought he'd be in a situation like this. The thought of exposing Linda, the woman he had loved for so long, to this kind of scrutiny, it was almost unbearable. I don't want to make things ugly, Carl, John said, his voice barely above a whisper. I just want to know the truth. There was a pause on the other end, and then Carl spoke again, his tone softening just slightly. I get it, man. You want to keep things clean, keep things respectful, but respect doesn't get you shit when you're the one getting played. She's out there with someone else, kissing him. Maybe more. You gotta get your ducks in a row before you make a move. You know I'm here for you, bro. If you need anything at all, I'm right here. But if you want my advice, get that PI. Get the proof you need, and then you can decide what to do with it. But don't do something you can't take back. John swallowed hard. His mind kept replaying the images, the video, Linda's face, her lips on another man. The sting of it all was too much to bear. He didn't want to believe it, didn't want to admit it, but it was staring him in the face. And Carl, John's voice cracked, his anger surfacing in short bursts. I swear to God, if I ever get my hands on this guy. Carl's voice was cold, direct. Don't go there, John. You want to end up in a cell, or worse. The underworld can make things disappear, but the cops won't. I know people, John. I could make this go away in a heartbeat, but you'd never come back from it. Trust me, don't go down that road. John's hands clenched around the phone, his body tense with the fury rising inside him. I get it, he finally said, his voice rough with restraint. I'll do it your way. I'll get the PI. I'll find out what's going on. But if I find out anything more, I'm not sure how I'll handle it. Carl was silent for a beat, then spoke, his tone softer but still firm. I'm here, bro. Just don't do anything you'll regret. You got this, just play it smart. John hung up the phone and stared at the wall, the weight of Carl's words pressing down on him. He knew what he had to do. He didn't want to, but the truth was, there was no other choice now. Linda had crossed a line, and he needed answers, before he did something he couldn't take back. His brother Carl's call had only made things more complicated. John wasn't sure if Carl's advice was meant to help him, or if he was trying to push him into something he wasn't ready for. The night had dragged on for John, his thoughts cycling endlessly between the shocking evidence Carl had shown him and the weight of what his brother had suggested. His phone sat next to him on the coffee table, still buzzing with messages he hadn't opened, notifications from friends, and texts from his wife, Linda. John hadn't dared open them yet. He wasn't sure he could handle hearing from her right now, especially with the images of her screwing another man still fresh in his mind. He could still see the lust she had in her eyes and how she was enjoying the other man. Just as he thought he could escape his own mind for a moment, his phone rang. It was Linda. John's heart skipped a beat. His hands hesitated before reaching for the phone, a mix of dread and longing rising in his chest. He took a breath, trying to steady himself, before answering. "Hey, babe," he said, keeping his voice neutral, though his mind was reeling. He had to keep it together. "Hey, you." Linda's voice was bright, warm, a stark contrast to the storm of emotions inside John. "I miss you so much. I can't wait to get home." There was a sincerity in her voice, but John couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. "I miss you too," he replied, trying to sound normal, trying to mask the unease he felt. He gripped the edge of the table, focusing on his breathing. "How's everything going down there?" "It's been great, actually, but I'm so ready to come home," she said, her tone playful. "I'm counting down the days. Only 2 more days, right? I can't wait to see you, and, well, I can't wait to get nasty with you." Her words hit him like a punch. Nasty with you. He tried to ignore the implications, to push back the anger and betrayal building inside him. The last time she'd said something like that, he'd never imagined she could be with someone else. He kept his voice steady. "Yeah, 2 days," he said, forcing a calmness into his voice. "I'm looking forward to it too." John swallowed hard, his mind racing. The images of Linda and the man still burned in his memory. Everything she said felt like a lie now. How could she sound so carefree, so happy, when she just betrayed him? His fingers tightened around the phone, the words in his head threatening to spill out, but he held them in. He couldn't confront her like this. Not yet. Not without the full picture. He needed to stay focused. He couldn't let her hear the crack in his voice. "I've been thinking about you a lot," Linda continued, oblivious to the storm swirling in John's head. "I've got all these plans for when I get home. I want to make it up to you, to show you just how much I've missed you. You won't be able to keep your hands off me, I promise." John clenched his jaw, the bile rising in his throat. She sounded so genuine, like everything was just as it always had been, like she hadn't just kissed another man, like her actions hadn't shattered the trust they'd built over the years. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "Yeah, sounds good," he managed, his words coming out tight and strained. "I'm sure you've got a lot of things planned. I'm looking forward to it." He forced the words out, but they tasted bitter on his tongue. There was a pause on the other end. "Is everything okay?" Linda asked, her voice softening, as if she sensed something was wrong. "Yeah," John lied, his mind racing, every fiber of his being screaming at him to tell her the truth. But he couldn't. Not yet. Not without proof. He didn't want to start an argument on the phone, especially when he didn't know the whole story. The PI was the next step. He had to get the facts first. "Everything's fine, Linda. Just miss you. That's all," John said, his voice quieter now, betraying his emotions despite his best efforts to mask them. Linda seemed to take his words at face value, her cheerfulness returning as she responded, "Good. I'm glad. I really can't wait to see you. I've got all these ideas. You're going to love it. Just 2 more days, John. 2 more days." The words felt like a dagger in his chest. 2 more days. In 2 days, he would have to face her. The woman he'd married, the woman he trusted, knowing everything he knew now. He felt like a stranger in his own marriage. Everything had been built on a lie. "I can't wait either," he said, his voice tight, but he forced a smile into it, pretending everything was normal. "All right, well, I've got to go. I'll talk to you tomorrow," she said, and John could hear the smile in her voice. "Yeah, talk to you then," he responded, his heart heavy. He hung up the phone slowly, his hand trembling. John sat in the silence that followed, staring at the phone in his hand. It was so surreal, hearing Linda's voice full of affection and longing, knowing what he knew. The images, the video, they felt like an anchor, pulling him further down into a sea of betrayal and confusion. Yet, Linda's words, her bright tone, felt like she was still playing her part in a script they'd written together for years. But the truth was now there, plain as day. Linda had crossed a line, and John couldn't ignore it any longer. He could only wait for the pieces to fall into place. 2 more days. It felt like a lifetime. The next morning, after the phone call with Linda, John knew he had to act. The gnawing suspicion, the heartbreak, the the confusion. It was all too much to keep inside. He couldn't let himself be in the dark any longer. Carl's advice echoed in his mind. Get the evidence, protect yourself. It was time. John found a private investigator online, someone with solid credentials and reviews. He set up an appointment. That afternoon, he stepped into the PI's office, his heart heavy with the weight of everything he was about to face. He didn't know how deep the rabbit hole went, but he needed to know the truth, even if it destroyed him. As he entered the office, the smell of coffee and old leather filled the air. The PI, a man named Frank, greeted him with a firm handshake. He looked like the type of person who had seen it all, worn, confident, with eyes that had a knack for reading people. Mr. Griffin, I'm Frank, the PI said, guiding him to a seat in front of a cluttered desk. I've gone over the details you sent, but I need to hear it from you. Start from the beginning. John sat down, swallowing hard. He hadn't said these words out loud yet. It was harder than he expected, but Frank's no-nonsense demeanor pushed him to speak. Well, my wife, Linda, she's been acting different lately, John began, his voice tight. She's been traveling a lot for work. But about a week ago, my brother called me. He said he saw her with another man in Florida, kissing him. I didn't believe it at first, but then he sent me pictures and a video. I'm not sure what to think, but I need to know if it's true. Frank nodded, writing everything down on a notepad in front of him. Got it. This isn't the first time I've heard a story like this. I'll run a surveillance on her. I'll get you the answers you need. John took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. How long will it take? Hard to say. It could take a few days, maybe a week, depending on her schedule. But we'll get you something solid, Frank assured him. John handed over the retainer fee, his hands shaking slightly. Just make sure you get the truth. I don't want to make a mistake here. I just need to know what's really going on. Frank nodded again. I understand. Leave it to me. The next day, Linda returned from Florida, all smiles and excitement, as if nothing had changed. John tried his best to mask the turmoil inside, to keep his cool, but it wasn't easy. She was home. After everything that had happened, after seeing those images, how could she act so normal? As she walked into the house, she wrapped her arms around him, planting a kiss on his lips. I missed you so much, baby, she said, her voice warm, her hands sliding down his back. John stiffened slightly but forced a smile. I missed you too, he replied, his voice steady, betraying none of the chaos swirling inside him. How was the trip? It was great, but I'm so glad to be home, she said, her eyes sparkling. She pulled back from him slightly, her expression shifting to something more playful. You know what I've been thinking about since I left? You and me. Together. I've been so frustrated with not being able to be with you. I need you, John. I can't wait to get you into bed. John's stomach churned. The last thing he wanted to do right now was get intimate with her, not after everything he knew. But he had to keep up the appearance of the happy husband, at least for now. He didn't want to arouse suspicion, didn't want to give her a reason to become defensive. Linda, he said, trying to sound apologetic but firm, I actually hurt my back while you were gone. I've been really sore. I think I just need to rest tonight. Her face fell slightly, but she recovered quickly, a pout forming on her lips. Oh, babe, that's disappointing. But if you're in pain, I guess I understand. She paused, her gaze searching his face. We can wait then. I'll be here when you're ready. I'll rest up, John replied, trying to smile through the discomfort. Just give me some time. We'll get there. Linda gave him a light kiss on the cheek before she turned and headed to their bedroom. John stood there for a moment, his heart racing. The feeling of betrayal still weighed on him heavily. He had been lying to her, just as she had lied to him. But this was the only way he could handle things for now, until he knew for sure what was going on. He couldn't confront her without solid evidence. He wouldn't make the mistake of acting on suspicion alone. That night, Linda slept soundly beside him. John lay awake, staring at the ceiling, every part of him unsettled, waiting for the moment when everything would come to light. A week later, John sat at home, trying to keep his mind off the situation, when his phone buzzed. It was Frank, the PI. John's heart skipped as he glanced at the screen. He'd been waiting for this call, but now that it was finally here, he wasn't sure if he was ready. He quickly answered the phone. Frank? It's John. What do you have for me? Frank's voice was low, almost cautious. We've got something. I need you to come into the office so I can show you the full report. It's important. John felt a cold rush of dread in his stomach. What's going on? Is it bad? Frank hesitated before responding. Just come in. We'll talk about it when you get here. John's mind raced. He felt a knot tighten in his chest. The waiting had been unbearable enough, but now it was about to end. He wasn't sure whether he was ready for what Frank was going to show him, but there was no turning back now. The truth, whatever it was about to come to light. Okay, I'll be there in 20 minutes. He hung up, staring at the phone in his hand, his pulse quickening. It was time to face the music. John walked into Frank's office, his nerves on edge, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He wasn't sure what he was expecting, but nothing could prepare him for what was about to unfold. Frank stood behind his desk, a glass of whiskey in hand, as he motioned for John to take a seat. "You look like you need something stronger than coffee," Frank said, offering him a shot of Jack Daniels. "I'll be blunt with you, John. This is going to hit hard." John didn't hesitate. He grabbed the glass and downed the shot in one go, the burn of the whiskey searing through his throat. It was a small comfort, the sharp sting briefly pulling his mind away from the storm that was brewing. "Thanks," John muttered, trying to steady his breath as he sat down. Just give it to me straight. What's going on?" Frank placed a thick folder on the desk and slid it over to John. "This is what I've got." I dug deep. "You're not going to like it, but I'm not going to sugarcoat it." John opened the folder, the contents shocking him in ways he hadn't imagined. There were pictures, grainy, but unmistakable, of Linda with two different men. The first was Timothy Brown, her boss at the company where she worked. The second was Alex Williams, the CEO. Each picture seemed to depict more than just casual flirtation. "They are screwing regularly." His heart sank further with each photo he flipped through. I don't understand," John muttered, his hand trembling as he turned the pages. "This is what's going on?" Frank sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Linda's been having sex with both of them, John. And not just seeing them. She's been screwing them, and at times both together. Regularly. The first guy, Timothy, he's her boss, and the second, Alex, he's the CEO. Looks like it's been going on for a while." John felt like the floor had dropped out from under him. He couldn't process it. The images, the words, it was all too much. But how long? How long has this been happening? Frank's expression softened, though his voice remained firm. 2 years, at least. They've been keeping it under wraps, but I found texts, emails, hell, even videos. They've been sneaking around, playing this game behind your back. And the worst part? It's not just them. It looks like they've been involved in threesomes too. There's a lot more going on than just a simple affair. John's mind raced, his chest tightening as he tried to hold on to something. Anything. This wasn't just a betrayal. This was a destruction of everything he thought he knew. The woman he'd trusted, the woman he'd built his life with, had been living a double life. Frank pushed a folder closer to him. "These," he said, his voice steady, "are some of the messages I found. They're explicit, but they'll show you what's been going on. I don't want you to think I'm pulling any punches here, John. I'm giving it to you straight." John swallowed hard and opened the folder. As he read through the messages, his stomach turned. There were texts between Linda, Timothy, and Alex. Messages that were casual at first but quickly escalated into graphic, intimate exchanges. And then there were the video clips, moments he could never unsee. He felt his heart shattering with every word, every image. They weren't just having an affair. They were living out some twisted, shared secret, something he had no part in, no clue about. I can't believe this," John whispered, his voice breaking. 2 years? She's been doing this behind my back for 2 years? Frank nodded grimly. "Yeah, I'm sorry, man, but I'm telling you, you need to face this. The affair isn't just casual, it's well organized. Linda's been playing you for a fool, and from what I can see, she's been doing it without any real guilt. It's all laid out here." John's hands shook as he set the folder down. He felt like he was suffocating, drowning in this overwhelming wave of betrayal. 2 men, his wife, threesomes. The affair had been going on right under his nose, hidden in plain sight. How had he missed it? This is more than I ever imagined," John said, his voice low, almost to himself. He looked up at Frank. "What do I do now? What do I even say to her?" Frank leaned forward, his gaze intense. "Well, that's up to you. But here's the thing, John. You need to think this through. Don't make any rash decisions. You've got everything you need now. You've got proof. You can confront her, or you can just walk away. But don't let her control the narrative. You have the facts now. You're not blind anymore." John nodded slowly, his mind working through the options. He felt a sense of numbness take over, the reality of the situation settling in. His marriage, his life, Everything he thought was real was crumbling before him. "Thanks, Frank," John said, though the words felt hollow. He didn't know what to feel: relief, anger, sadness, disbelief. It was all a blur now. Frank gave a small, sympathetic nod. "Take your time, John. Think about what you want. I'm here if you need anything else. But whatever you decide, just know you've got options now. You're not in the dark anymore." John stood up, his mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. He needed air. He needed time. But most of all, he needed to confront Linda. The life he thought he knew had been shattered, and now he had to decide how to move forward. John sat at his desk, his laptop open in front of him, the weight of the situation heavier than ever. His fingers hovered over the keyboard as he clicked through the videos and texts Frank had sent him. He had already seen enough to know that his world was shattering, but as he dug deeper into the documents, he felt his heart sink even further. The first video was of Linda, having sex and talking to Timothy Brown, her boss. But it wasn't the laughter that struck him the most. It was what she was saying. "You know, I'm just keeping John around because he's good with the kids and pays the bills," Linda said casually, her voice filled with disdain. "He's a total loser, but he's a great provider. So why not keep him around, right?" John's breath caught in his throat. A loser? He couldn't believe it. The woman he'd loved, the woman who'd promised to build a life with him, was speaking like this. As he clicked on another video, his stomach twisted as the next conversation unfolded. "This marriage is just for show," Linda continued, speaking now to Alex Williams, the CEO. "John's a good guy. He does his part. But he's never been what I wanted. He is just a slow in bed. I wanted aggressive and dominating. I'm just using him. As long as I keep up the act, I've got a nice house, I've got the kids, and I can have fun with you guys. What does it matter?" John couldn't breathe. He had always believed their life was a partnership. They had raised 2 boys together, navigated the ups and downs of marriage. But this was a betrayal on a level he hadn't even imagined. She wasn't just having an affair. She was openly mocking him, using him for financial stability and the appearance of a normal family. But the worst part was yet to come. As he clicked through more texts, he found a chilling message Linda had sent to Timothy, one that completely shattered whatever hope he'd been holding on to. "If John ever finds out, I'll just hang him for the kids," Linda had written. "I'll accuse him of being abusive, and I'll make sure the boys stay with me. He's the one with the good job. He won't stand a chance if I say he's been hitting me. And then I'll take everything. His house, his savings. I'll take it all. He's not a real man. He's just a sucker who's doing what I tell him." John felt his blood run cold. The words echoed in his mind, spinning around like a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. She planned this all along. She'd been using him, manipulating him, and now she was threatening to ruin him completely if he ever tried to fight back. A deep rage boiled inside him, but it was mixed with a profound sense of betrayal. How had he not seen it? How had he been so blind? The woman who he thought loved him, the woman he thought was his partner in life, was nothing more than a calculating, deceitful person. And the worst part was that she wasn't even afraid of him finding out. She was confident, almost smug, in the knowledge that she could destroy him if he ever tried to leave her. John slammed the laptop shut, his hands trembling. He sat there for a moment, trying to process everything. His chest felt tight, and his mind raced with the realization of just how trapped he was. She knew she had control over me. She knew I'd never leave her because I'd lose everything. And now she was daring me to try. He ran his hands through his hair, pacing back and forth in his study. His thoughts were spinning. He felt like a prisoner in his own home, like every part of his life had been manipulated by the woman he trusted the most. He loved his boys more than anything, and the idea of losing them was unbearable. But was that what she wanted? Was that her plan all along? To make sure he stayed locked in place, scared and helpless, just so she could have it all? The anger built up in him, but there was also a deep sorrow, a grief for the man he had been, the man who thought his marriage was built on love and trust. He had been a fool, and now, everything he thought he knew was gone. But one thing was certain now. He couldn't stay in this marriage, not anymore. If Linda was willing to destroy him, to tear apart their family for her own selfish desires, he couldn't let that happen. He would find a way out. He had to. For the sake of his boys, for the sake of his own sanity, he had to fight back. John grabbed his phone, his fingers shaking as he dialed Carl's number. His brother picked up almost immediately. "Carl, it's John," he said, his voice strained. "I need your help. I've got everything. I can't stay in this marriage anymore. She's been lying to me for years. And now, she's threatening to take everything. I don't know if I can beat her at this, but I have to try. Carl's voice was low, but steady. You've got this, John. We'll figure it out. Just don't make any rash moves yet. We'll take this step by step. You've got evidence now. It's time to make sure you protect yourself and your boys. I'm here for you, man. Whatever you need. John took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment. He had a long road ahead of him, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he had a chance, like he wasn't completely powerless. This wasn't over. He wouldn't let Linda win. John sat at the dinner table, his mind racing as Linda walked in late, her heels clicking against the floor. She was smiling, chatting casually, like everything was normal. She slid into her chair and began to talk about her day, how successful her meeting had been, how she had scored a new deal for the company. She seemed upbeat, carefree, completely unaware that the world around her had shifted for John. He set his fork down, his eyes fixed on her. This is it, he thought. The moment I have to confront her, but not just yet. I need to let her squirm a bit. So, John began, trying to keep his tone casual, masking the storm that raged within him. How was your day? Linda smiled brightly, almost as if she didn't notice the tension in his voice. Oh, it was amazing. We closed a huge deal today. I'm pretty much on top of the world right now. And how was your day, babe? Anything exciting? John paused for a second, looking at her. He could feel the anger building up inside of him, but he couldn't let it explode just yet. Not yet. He had to play it cool. You know, just the usual. Same old stuff. I was thinking about something, though. What would you do if you found out I was sleeping with 2 women? Linda didn't miss a beat. She laughed, the sound too light, too carefree, for what the question really meant. Oh, I'd chop your balls off, for sure. You'd be sleeping in the guest room with a lot of painkillers, my friend. John let out a slow breath, a sly smile creeping onto his face. Well, that's interesting, he said, keeping his voice even. Because if I find out that you're doing the same thing, sleeping with 2 men, I suppose I should do the same, huh? Linda froze, her eyes widening slightly, the smile fading just a fraction as she looked at him, her fork halfway to her mouth. She set it down slowly, studying his face. There was a moment of silence between them, thick with tension. John could feel her trying to read him, trying to decipher if he was joking, or if he had actually discovered something. What? She stammered, her voice suddenly uncertain, the confidence from earlier slipping away. What do you mean by that? John leaned back in his chair, not breaking eye contact. He let the silence stretch out for a moment, watching her, enjoying the moment of power. She has no idea that I know everything, he thought. She has no idea that the tables have turned. Oh, nothing, John said, smiling wider now, the edge of satisfaction creeping into his tone. I just think it's funny how you were so sure you'd chop my balls off if I ever did something like that. Just curious if you'd think the same thing if you were in my shoes. That's all. Linda's expression faltered, a flicker of fear in her eyes before she quickly masked it with a forced laugh. You're being ridiculous, John. I don't know what you're talking about. There's no way you'd ever find out something like that. John smiled even wider now, his voice steady, almost casual. Oh, I'm sure I wouldn't, right? Linda's eyes darted away for just a second, and John saw the smallest crack in her armor. It was enough to tell him that something was off. Something was wrong. He knew. She was hiding something, and it was eating away at her, just as it had been eating away at him. But now, he was in control. She cleared her throat, visibly trying to regain her composure. Honestly, John, I don't know what's gotten into you lately. You're acting like some jealous teenager. Can't you just trust me? John shook his head, his voice softer now, almost too calm. Oh, I trust you, Linda. I just wish I'd known sooner what you were really up to. But don't worry, we'll figure it out. Just a matter of time, I guess. The words hung in the air between them, heavy and full of meaning. Linda seemed to realize in that moment that something had changed. There was no going back now. John, what are you talking about? Her voice was shaky now, but she tried to cover it up with a nervous laugh. I don't know what's going on with you, but this isn't funny anymore. John remained calm, his gaze unwavering. You're right, Linda. It's not funny. But I think you'll be the one laughing when I have everything I need to prove exactly what's been going on. Linda's face paled, and for the first time since she'd walked through the door, she looked truly afraid. But John didn't care about her fear. He didn't care about the tears that might come later, or the apologies she might offer. No, this moment was for him, for his dignity, for his sanity. He had been living a lie for too long, and now, the truth was finally coming out. He stood up slowly, his chair scraping against the floor. "But don't worry, Linda," he said, his tone lighter now, almost playful. "I'll let you explain yourself. I'm sure you've got a perfectly reasonable explanation for all this." Linda stared at him, her face a mix of confusion, fear, and something that looked a lot like guilt. But John didn't wait for her response. He turned and walked out of the room, the taste of victory bitter on his tongue. The confrontation was just beginning. John sat across from Carl in a quiet coffee shop, the two of them barely speaking as they exchanged glances. The weight of the previous day's conversation was still heavy on John's mind, but now there was a sense of clarity. He wasn't going to sit around and let Linda walk all over him anymore. It was time to take control, to make sure she couldn't destroy him, his family, or everything he had worked for. "I'm glad you're on board with this, Carl," John said, taking a sip of his coffee. He looked down at the table, trying to collect his thoughts. "I can't keep living this lie. She's crossed every line possible." Carl nodded, his expression serious but supportive. "You're right, man. She's been playing you for too long. We're not letting her get away with it. We'll make sure she feels the consequences. You've got my back, and I've got yours. We'll take her down." The determination in Carl's voice gave John some comfort. He wasn't alone in this battle, not anymore. Together, they'd go after everything Linda had built and make sure she faced the consequences for everything she'd done. They had agreed to meet with a divorce lawyer, someone who had a reputation for being a shark in the courtroom. The lawyer's office was sleek and modern, the kind of place where people with money went when they needed a no-nonsense approach. John could already feel the tension rising as they walked in. The lawyer, a sharp-looking man in his 40s with a suit that cost more than John's entire wardrobe, stood up from behind his desk when they entered. "Mr. Griffin," he said, extending his hand with a practiced smile. "Pleasure to meet you. I understand we have quite a case to work with here." John shook his hand firmly. "Let's get to it," he said, his voice steady. "I'm ready to move forward." The lawyer gestured for them to sit down. Once they were settled, he wasted no time getting to the heart of the matter. "All right, here's what we'll do. We'll start with the divorce paperwork, but we'll also need to go after Linda's employers. I understand you want to file an alienation of affection lawsuit against her boss and the CEO of the company, correct?" John nodded. "Yes, they're just as guilty as she is. They've known about the affair for a long time, and they've done nothing. I want them to feel the heat for enabling this." The lawyer smiled, impressed. "That's a bold move, but it could pay off. We'll need to gather as much evidence as possible. I'll handle the legal side of things, but you'll need to make sure you're financially sorted. We'll need a clear picture of your assets, liabilities, and income before we can proceed." John felt a knot tighten in his stomach. Sorting his finances was the last thing he wanted to deal with, but he knew it was necessary. He'd spent years trusting Linda with the finances, but now he realized just how much control she had over their situation. "Yeah, I've been putting it off," John admitted, "but I'll get it together. I'll gather everything, bank statements, investments, retirement funds, whatever you need." The lawyer nodded, jotting down some notes. "Good. You'll want to start that right away. The faster we get everything sorted, the faster we can move forward with the divorce. We'll also need to establish a timeline for the affair and any other evidence of misconduct on her part. But for now, the financials are priority." John leaned back in his chair, feeling a mix of dread and resolve. He had no choice now but to face the financial reality of his situation. It felt overwhelming, but it was nothing compared to the betrayal he had been living with. He could handle this. "I'll get it together," John said, his voice firm. "Just get the paperwork ready. I want to move fast." The lawyer gave him a reassuring nod. "You're in good hands. Give me 3 days to get the divorce paperwork and the lawsuit forms ready. In the meantime, focus on your finances. Once that's done, we can take the next steps. We'll go after everything. I'm confident we can win this." John stood up, feeling a weight lift slightly off his shoulders, but a new heaviness replaced it. The reality of what he was about to do hit him harder now. Divorce. Lawsuits. The fight ahead wasn't going to be easy, but it was the only choice left. He wasn't just fighting for his life. He was fighting for his future, his children, and his dignity. "I'll get it done," John said, shaking the lawyer's hand. "Thanks for your help. Let's get this over with." As John and Carl left the lawyer's office, Carl gave him a firm clap on the back. "You're doing the right thing, John. No turning back now. We'll get you through this." John didn't respond at first. He was already thinking ahead, considering everything he would have to do. But one thing was clear. This was just the beginning of a long fight. He had no intention of letting Linda, or anyone else, take everything he'd worked for without a fight. 3 days later, John walked into the lawyer's office with Carl at his side, both of them feeling a mix of tension and anticipation. 3 days had passed since their last meeting, and now it was time to take the next step. John had made his move, sold all his assets to Carl for a small amount, and loaning all his money to Carl for a new business venture. It was a bold, risky play, but it was the only way John could protect his future from Linda's manipulation. The lawyer greeted them with a raised eyebrow, clearly curious. As they sat down, Carl quickly explained the situation to him. "So, John has loaned me all his money as part of a business deal," Carl said, leaning forward, his voice steady. "Everything is now in my name. All assets, the house, savings, investments, everything. It's a business loan for a new venture I'm starting. No ties to him anymore." The lawyer stared at them for a moment, a sharp laugh escaping his lips. "Well, this is unconventional. Honestly, it's a stupid move on your part, John. But then again, I've seen worse. If the judge isn't a man-hating bimbo, it might just work. It certainly puts things in a different light." John felt a knot in his stomach at the lawyer's bluntness, but he didn't flinch. He knew what he was doing. The transfer was his safeguard, making sure that Linda couldn't claim anything in the divorce, that she couldn't come after him for the house, or any savings he had built up over the years. "I don't care if it's unconventional," John said, his voice firm. "I just need to make sure she can't touch anything. If she thinks she can take my house or assets, she's wrong. I'm making sure she won't get a penny. Carl's the one handling that now. And when this goes down, I want it to be clean. I want everything to go through quickly and without her making a mess of it." The lawyer leaned back in his chair, considering John's words. "All right, it's a tricky situation, but there's nothing wrong with protecting yourself, even if it's unorthodox. I'll get the paperwork for the divorce ready. But you're also asking for a restraining order, I take it?" John nodded, his jaw tight. "Yes, I want the restraining order to keep her away from the kids in my house. She's not getting near them, not after everything she's done. If I have to go to extreme lengths to protect them, I will." Carl gave him a supportive nod, his expression serious. "He's right. Linda has no business being near them after what we know. We can't risk her manipulating them or causing trouble in their lives. They need to be safe." The lawyer didn't miss a beat. "Understood. We'll file for the restraining order along with the divorce papers. You're within your rights to protect your children. I'll make sure everything's in order, but just be prepared. This will get ugly. She's going to fight back." John's fingers tightened into fists at the thought of Linda's reaction. He knew she wouldn't just let him walk away without trying to retaliate. But it didn't matter. He was done with her games. His priority now was his children, keeping them safe and protecting their future. "I'm ready for whatever comes next," John said, meeting the lawyer's eyes. "Just make sure the papers are ready, and I want her served as soon as possible. No delays." The lawyer gave him a quick nod, already scribbling down notes. "I'll get everything ready. We'll file for the restraining order and the divorce papers simultaneously. I'll have them served to her in the next few days." John stood up, a sense of finality settling over him. This was it. He was taking the first real step towards freeing himself from Linda. It was going to be a battle, but he was prepared to fight. He looked at Carl, who gave him a firm nod of encouragement, and then back to the lawyer, who was already organizing the next steps. "Make it happen," John said, his voice low and resolute. "I don't care how long it takes. Just get it done." The lawyer didn't respond immediately, but there was no mistaking the quiet approval in his eyes. "It'll be done, John. And trust me, we're in this to win." Linda lay sprawled on the CEO's desk, her breaths heavy and quick as he leaned over her. Their affair, one of many secrets Linda had kept, had been going on for over 2 years. It was a dangerous game, one that she was sure she could keep hidden, but today, something felt different. The door to the CEO's office was closed, the blinds drawn, as they shared another moment of stolen intimacy. The stakes were high, but she didn't care. She was in control. Then, suddenly, a sharp knock at the door broke through the haze of their passion. Both of them froze, panic creeping in as they quickly scrambled to adjust themselves. The CEO's hand was already on the button of his pants when another knock came, this time more insistent. "Shit," Linda muttered under her breath, straightening her blouse. The CEO was fast to button up his shirt as well, his face tense. "Who the hell is it?" he called out, his voice sharp, but the intruder didn't answer immediately. The door creaked open a moment later, and a man in a sharp business suit stepped inside without waiting for a response. Linda's heart skipped a beat as she recognized him immediately, a process server. The man was holding 3 manila envelopes, each sealed tightly and labeled with precise clarity. Without saying a word, he handed one envelope to Linda, one to the CEO, and one addressed to the company itself. "Mr. Griffin has filed a lawsuit against you," the server said, his voice neutral but firm. "You've been served. Divorce petition for Ms. Linda Griffin and a restraining order." The lawsuit includes claims against the company for alienation of affection. The total claim is for $20 million. Linda's blood ran cold. She glanced at the envelope in her hands, her fingers trembling. The CEO took his envelope without saying anything, his usual calm demeanor now replaced by a visible flicker of concern. He turned to Linda, his eyes wide. "John did this?" he asked, his voice betraying his shock. "What the hell is this?" Linda's mind was racing. How had he found out? How did everything come crashing down like this? She quickly tore open the envelope, pulling out the divorce papers first. Her stomach dropped as she read through them, the words like a slap to the face. It was official. John was done with her. He wasn't just seeking a divorce, though. The restraining order was attached to it, and it made clear that she could no longer come within a certain distance of their children. The pain of it all, the utter betrayal, was suffocating. "John," she whispered, her voice faltering as her anger started to bubble beneath the surface. She was furious, not just at him, but at everything that had led up to this moment. He had always been so predictable, so weak in her eyes. How could he have done this to her, after everything? The CEO looked at her, his face a mix of concern and frustration. "This is a mess, Linda. We've got to handle this carefully." But Linda's mind was elsewhere, her thoughts spinning. She had to think of something, anything, to get out of this. She could feel the walls closing in. John had turned the tables on her, and now the consequences of her actions, of the affair, of her manipulations, were starting to catch up with her. As she continued to process the divorce petition and restraining order, the reality of the lawsuit set in. $20 million. John had hit her where it hurt the most. Her reputation, her career, and everything she had been building. This wasn't just a personal attack. It was an all-out assault on her professional life. The CEO rubbed his temples, clearly stressed. "This isn't just about the affair anymore. The company's involved. We'll need a solid defense. We can't let this go down quietly." Linda took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. She was trapped, but she wasn't going down without a fight. She knew she had to do whatever it took to try to salvage her career, her reputation, and, most importantly, her finances. As the process server turned to leave, Linda shot him one last look. The words echoed in her mind, the weight of them settling in like a heavy fog. $20 million. The door to the CEO's office swung open once again, and the HR head walked in, his face grim. He didn't waste any time with pleasantries. "Alex, I need you to vacate your office immediately," the HR head said, his voice firm and devoid of any empathy. "You and Linda are to clear your things. Your access to company assets and premises has been revoked effective immediately." Alex, still trying to process what had just happened with the lawsuit and the divorce papers, stood frozen for a moment. His face drained of color as he glanced from the HR head to Linda, who was still clutching her own envelope, her knuckles white. "What do you mean revoked?" Alex demanded, his voice a little shaky. "This is a mistake. There's no way they can. The head office, shareholders, and all the promoters have already been informed," the HR head interrupted, pulling out his phone and showing Alex a series of emails. "They've all received the evidence, the texts, the emails, the videos. This isn't a mistake. You and Linda are both terminated. Immediately. Your severance and benefits will be handled through legal channels. But for now, you're done." Linda's heart raced. She looked from the HR head to Alex, her mind spinning. This was happening too fast. It was all falling apart. Her affair, her manipulation, everything she'd worked so hard to maintain. It was all being exposed in front of her, with no time to react. Alex stared at the HR head in disbelief. "You can't just do this. We're talking about years of work, my career. What about the company?" The HR head was unrelenting. "The company doesn't tolerate this. You've compromised not only your own position but the company's integrity. The shareholders will have their say on what happens next, but as of right now, you're both out. Pack your things and leave." The HR head turned to Linda, giving her no more consideration than he had given Alex. "And you, Linda, your access to the building and systems is also revoked. Please make arrangements to clear out by the end of the day." Alex's voice trembled with frustration, but there was nothing he could do. He turned to Linda, his expression pained. "We'll figure this out. We need to make some calls. Don't let this be the end." But Linda, her mind still reeling, only half heard him. She was too focused on the emails and evidence that had already been sent to everyone who mattered. The truth was out now. There was no going back. As they began gathering their things, Alex's phone buzzed incessantly with notifications. He glanced at it and swore under his breath. His eyes met Linda's, filled with dread. "It's from my wife," he muttered, staring at the screen. "She knows. I think she knows everything." His hand trembled as he typed a response, trying to salvage something from the situation. Linda's stomach twisted in knots. She glanced at her own phone and saw that her inbox was full, dozens of texts, emails, and missed calls. Her mind raced as she scrolled through them, her heart sinking with every message. By the time she reached her car, her phone rang again. This time, it was her boss, Timothy Brown. His voice was frantic. "You won't believe this, but I've been served," he said, his voice thick with disbelief. "Divorce papers. And a restraining order. What the hell is going on, Linda? This isn't just about you and me anymore. My wife is on the warpath. She has everything. Texts, videos, the works. We're both screwed." Linda's mind was a blur, but she managed to speak through the haze. "It's over, Timothy. They've got it all. John's filing lawsuits. The company's gone. There's no way out of this now." Timothy swore again, and Linda could hear his frustration grow as the weight of everything settled in. "My wife has already served me with divorce papers. She's filing a restraining order. Same as yours. I'm done." With that, the reality hit her like a slap to the face. It wasn't just her marriage that was falling apart. It was her career, her reputation, everything she'd built, all crumbling before her eyes. And she wasn't alone. Alex, Timothy, and her boss were all facing the same consequences. Back at home, by the end of the day, both Alex and Timothy's wives had served them with divorce papers as well. The restraining orders had been filed, sealing their fates. As the papers were delivered, the gravity of the situation fully sank in for everyone involved. Linda sat in her car, her phone clutched in her trembling hands, staring blankly ahead. Everything was over. The life she had built, the lies she'd told. Her betrayal had caught up with her in a way she hadn't imagined. Across town, John sat with Carl, watching as the pieces of his revenge fell into place. It was done. Linda was served. The company was now reeling from the scandal, and John had finally taken back control of his life. The night had fallen thick and quiet around John's home, a sharp contrast to the storm brewing inside. Linda, her heart pounding with rage, had stewed in her own bitterness for days, ever since her entire world had been unraveled. John had humiliated her, exposed her, and taken away everything she had. Now, she wanted revenge. In the dimly lit living room of Alex's apartment, Linda, Alex, and Timothy huddled around a table, whispering fervently as they devised a plan. The fury in Linda's eyes was unmistakable. She was no longer the woman who had tried to keep up appearances. Now, she was someone consumed with the need to destroy John, to make him pay for what he'd done. "He has to suffer," Linda hissed, her fingers tightening into fists. "We'll make sure he never sees another day of happiness. I want him gone, Alex. I want him to feel everything I've felt." Alex, always the more composed of the three, glanced at Timothy. "We'll need a plan. We do this right, no mistakes. It has to look like an accident." Timothy, usually the more reckless of the bunch, nodded in agreement, a dark smirk on his face. "We'll take care of it. Don't worry. He'll never know what hit him." That night, as John sat at home recovering from the emotional devastation of the past few days, he was unaware that his life was about to be upended once more. The house was quiet, the only sounds coming from the occasional creak of the floorboards, the low hum of the refrigerator. Carl was with him, staying close just in case the tension with Linda escalated any further. Carl had been his closest ally, and though John's body ached from the weight of his newfound reality, Carl had his back, both emotionally and physically. Around midnight, a sudden loud knock echoed through the front door. "Who the hell?" John started, but Carl was already on his feet, his hand instinctively reaching for the weapon he kept at hand. The door burst open before Carl could reach it. Linda, Alex, and Timothy stormed into the house, and before John could react, Linda pulled a gun from the bag she'd been carrying, the barrel aimed straight at him. "Did you really think you could ruin my life and get away with it?" Linda spat, her voice low and venomous. Her hands were shaking, but her eyes were wild with fury. John barely had time to react before the gunshots rang out, the sharp pain ripping through his stomach. He collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath as the cold seared through his body. Blood began to pool beneath him. Carl, reacting in a split second, grabbed his own gun from a nearby drawer, firing back with precise aim. The sound of the gunshots echoed in the house. Linda screamed as she ducked behind Alex and Timothy for cover. The exchange of gunfire was quick but chaotic. The attackers were unprepared for Carl's swift defense. "Get out of here!" Carl yelled as he fired once more, hitting the wall beside Linda. The three assailants scrambled for the door, their plans falling apart in the face of Carl's sudden defense. Linda was the first to run, followed closely by Alex and Timothy. The sound of their feet pounding on the floor as they fled the scene echoed in Carl's ears. He moved toward John, who was lying motionless on the floor, his face pale, blood staining the carpet around him. "John!" Carl shouted, rushing to his side. The pain in John's face was evident, his breathing shallow and labored. Carl, knowing he had to act fast, pulled out his phone and called 911. "Send an ambulance. My brother has been shot, twice in the stomach." Carl's voice was urgent and sharp, but there was no time for hesitation. "Hurry!" The sirens wailed in the distance, drawing nearer. Carl stayed by John's side, doing his best to stem the bleeding with his shirt, but the situation was dire. The pain was evident in John's eyes, but he fought to stay conscious, aware that he needed to hold on long enough for help to arrive. Hours later, at the hospital, John was stabilized but still unconscious, his body weak from the gunshot wounds. Carl paced nervously in the waiting room, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on him. He couldn't help but think about how quickly things had spiraled. Linda, Alex, and Timothy had clearly gone too far, and now the police would be after them. The police were already starting their investigation, piecing together the events from the scene. The attack was ruthless, but the assailants had left behind evidence. Surveillance footage from the neighborhood caught glimpses of their fleeing figures, and the authorities were quickly putting together a case. Linda and her accomplices were on the run. As the night passed, the authorities were already on high alert, putting out an APB for Linda and her two lovers. The danger they had caused would not go unpunished, and their lives, just like John's, had been irrevocably changed in a single, violent moment. Carl sat, waiting for news, the reality of what had just unfolded beginning to sink in. He knew that the worst wasn't over, not by a long shot. Carl sat in his car, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. His mind raced with thoughts of revenge, of what had just transpired. John was lying in a hospital bed, fighting for his life, and Linda was the one responsible. Her and her lovers had tried to take everything from John, and Carl wasn't going to let them get away with it. Not after what they did to his brother. Picking up his phone, Carl dialed a number from his past, one he hadn't used in years. A voice on the other end picked up quickly. "Yeah, Carl," the voice rasped. "What's up? I need you and the crew to meet me. We've got work to do," Carl said, his tone cold. "John's been attacked. Linda and her two lovers are the ones behind it. We need to make sure they don't get away with this." There was a brief silence, and then the voice replied. "We're in. Where do we need to be?" Carl went over the details quickly. 3 of the crew would stay behind to guard John at the hospital, making sure no one else tried to harm him while he recovered. 7 others would help Carl find Linda and her lovers. He didn't need to explain much further. They knew how to handle things when it came to vengeance. These men weren't strangers to dirty work. Carl hung up and immediately reached out to the PI he'd worked with earlier. The man had managed to get some information about Linda's whereabouts after the shooting. It didn't take long for the PI to trace her down to a house downtown. The address is 4516 Edgewood Avenue. She's holed up there with the other 2. "Be careful," the PI said, his voice urgent. Carl thanked him and quickly gathered the crew in his car. He could feel the tension building as they headed toward Linda's location. They were moving fast, intent on getting there before Linda and her lovers had a chance to flee again. He knew the only way to handle this now was to make sure they couldn't escape, to make them understand the consequences of crossing him and John. When they arrived, Carl's crew quickly surrounded the house. The lights were on inside, and there were shadows moving through the windows. Carl didn't hesitate. With a signal, his men burst through the door, crashing it open with force. The door splintered and gave way, and Carl and his men flooded the house like a wave, guns drawn, determined. Inside, Linda, Alex, and Timothy were caught completely off guard. They froze, eyes wide with shock, as Carl and his crew moved swiftly through the rooms, securing the 3 of them. "What the hell?" Alex started, but his words were cut off as Carl stepped forward, his hand raised to silence him. "You've caused enough trouble, boy. Carl said with a cold edge in his voice. You and your little bitch here are going to pay for what you did to John. Linda's face twisted with fear, her bravado from earlier gone. Carl, you don't understand, she pleaded, trying to step back. They forced me to join them, but Carl wasn't listening. He motioned for two of his men to restrain her, while others did the same to Alex and Timothy. The three of them were quickly tied up with thick ropes, their limbs bound tightly as they were shoved against the wall. They tried to struggle, but the restraints held firm. Don't even try to talk your way out of this, Carl growled, his voice low and threatening. You thought you could take everything from John and get away with it, but you're going to regret that decision. Linda, her eyes wide with panic, tried to squirm, but there was no escape. You can't do this. You can't just… Oh, I can, Carl said, stepping closer to her. You've got no leverage now. No one is coming to save you. You're finished. Carl glanced at his crew, signaling them to secure the area. This wasn't about killing them, at least, not yet. This was about making sure they felt the weight of their actions, making them understand that Carl's brother wasn't someone they could just walk over. We've got plans for you, Carl said, his voice dark. You're going to wish you never crossed John. You're going to wish you never got involved in this. The house was silent, the only sound the faint whimpering from Linda and the sharp breaths of Alex and Timothy. They knew what was coming, but it was too late to stop it now. Carl wasn't going to let them destroy John. And if that meant making sure they paid for their actions, so be it. The night air was thick and tense as Carl's crew drove in a convoy of 3 black SUVs, their headlights cutting through the darkness. The bound and gagged forms of Linda, Alex, and Timothy sat in the back seat of the lead vehicle, flanked by 2 of Carl's most intimidating men. Their muffled protests and futile struggles were met with cold, unflinching silence. No one in the crew said much during the drive, the mood heavy with purpose and determination. Carl sat in the passenger seat of the second SUV, his eyes fixed ahead, his mind racing with anger and betrayal. His brother, John, was fighting for his life because of these 3, and Carl wasn't about to let that slide. He leaned back in his seat, the glint of the moonlight catching the gun holstered at his side. His crew trusted him implicitly, but even they were unsure about how far this would go. One of the men driving glanced over at Carl. You sure about this, boss? He asked cautiously, his hands gripping the wheel. This isn't just a warning. This is serious business. Carl didn't hesitate. His voice was cold and deliberate. They tried to kill my brother. My own flesh and blood. That's a line you don't cross. They need to pay for what they've done. The driver nodded, saying nothing more as the vehicles continued their journey toward the border. They were heading to a remote spot Carl knew well from his past, a desolate area where no one would stumble across them. It wasn't long before the convoy reached the border. The vehicles rolled across, their movements precise and practiced. Carl's crew had been through situations like this before, though not quite as personal. They understood the stakes. Finally, they arrived at the location, a barren, dusty clearing surrounded by scrub and silence. The moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the scene. The SUVs came to a stop, their engines cutting out one by one. The men stepped out, moving with purpose as they opened the doors to the lead vehicle. Linda, Alex, and Timothy were dragged out roughly, their muffled cries barely audible through the gags. The 3 of them struggled weakly, their eyes wide with fear as they were forced to their knees on the cold, hard ground. Dust kicked up around them as they were thrown down, their bodies landing with a thud. Carl stepped forward, his boots crunching against the dirt. He looked down at them, his face a mask of cold fury. The rest of his crew stood back, their faces unreadable, waiting for Carl to make the next move. The 3 captives squirmed and whimpered, the reality of their situation sinking in. Linda's wide, tear-filled eyes met Carl's, silently begging for mercy, while Alex and Timothy exchanged panicked glances, their faces pale with terror. Carl crossed his arms, his voice low and steady. You thought you could destroy my family and walk away? He shook his head slowly. You don't get to do that. Not on my watch. The clearing fell silent, the weight of Carl's words hanging heavy in the air as the 3 captives remained on the ground, trembling in fear. The wind howled softly through the clearing, carrying with it the weight of impending doom. Carl's boots crunched against the gravel as he paced toward the restrained trio. His face was grim, his eyes shadowed with a mix of rage and sorrow. The machete gleamed in his hand, its sharp edge catching the pale moonlight, reflecting a cold, unyielding determination. Linda, Alex, and Timothy were trembling, their muffled whimpers and cries barely audible over the sound of Carl's deliberate footsteps. Carl stopped a few feet in front of them, his gaze fixed on Linda. Slowly, he raised his hand, signaling to one of his men. The man nodded silently and stepped forward, placing the machete in Carl's outstretched hand before retreating back into the shadows. Carl turned the blade in his hand, inspecting it as if weighing his next move. His voice, low and steady, broke the heavy silence. "You know," he began, his tone carrying a quiet menace, "I gave up my life of crime for my brother. For his kids. They were my light in all that darkness. They gave me a reason to try to be better." He paused, letting the words sink in as his piercing gaze flicked between the three. "But then there's you," he continued, his voice hardening. "You had to push. You had to ruin lives. And now here I am, back on that same dark road I fought so hard to leave behind." Carl stepped closer to Linda, his presence looming over her. "You woke something in me that I hoped I'd buried for good. You woke the devil." The clearing was dead silent as Carl's words hung in the air like a blade poised to strike. He motioned with the machete, and two of his men pulled Linda roughly to her feet, forcing her to stand. Her knees wobbled, and she could barely hold herself upright as they steadied her. "Face them," Carl commanded, gesturing toward Alex and Timothy, who were still bound and kneeling on the ground. Linda hesitated, her body shaking violently, until one of Carl's men grabbed her by the shoulders and spun her around to face her lovers. Carl stepped closer, standing just behind her, the machete resting lightly against his shoulder. His voice dropped to a near whisper, but its intensity was bone-chilling. "Let me ask you the same question my brother asked you," he said, leaning in close to her ear. "What happens if John finds you with two men?" Linda's breath hitched, her body rigid as she stared helplessly at the two men in front of her, their own eyes wide with fear. The air in the clearing was thick with tension, the silence punctuated only by the distant rustle of the wind through the trees. Carl stood still for a moment, the machete gleaming ominously in his hand, his face devoid of emotion. He glanced at Linda, whose eyes were wide with terror, and then shifted his gaze to Alex and Timothy, kneeling and bound, their muffled cries growing louder as the reality of their situation set in. "Yes," Carl said finally, his voice low and menacing. "You chop balls. Isn't that what you said, Linda?" Linda let out a strangled whimper, unable to respond. Carl gave a curt signal, and two of his men moved forward with purpose. They grabbed Alex and Timothy by their legs, forcing them down onto the dusty ground despite their panicked attempts to struggle free. The muffled screams of the two men filled the clearing, but Carl remained unmoved, his expression as cold and unyielding as the blade he held. "Hold them steady," Carl commanded, his voice sharp and commanding. His men tightened their grip, pinning the two men in place. Alex's eyes bulged with fear, and Timothy thrashed against his restraints, his muffled cries growing more frantic. Carl stepped toward Timothy first, his steps deliberate and slow, like a predator closing in on its prey. He knelt slightly, bringing himself to Alex's eye level. "You thought you could destroy my brother's life, take his family, and walk away like nothing happened?" Carl's voice was calm, almost conversational. "Actions have consequences. And now, you get to face yours." Without hesitation, Carl raised the machete high and brought it down in one swift, brutal motion. The sickening sound of the blade meeting flesh echoed through the clearing, followed by Alex's muffled scream of agony. Blood pooled on the ground beneath him as Carl stood, his face stoic, and turned his attention to Timothy. Linda was sobbing uncontrollably now, her body shaking violently as she watched the scene unfold. "Please, Carl," she cried out, her voice breaking through her gag. "Stop this, please." Carl ignored her, moving toward Alex, who was now frozen in terror. "And you," Carl said coldly, standing over him. "You thought being a CEO made you untouchable? That you could ruin lives without a second thought?" He crouched down slightly, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Think again." Once more, the machete rose and fell with brutal precision. Timothy's muffled scream tore through the air, mingling with Linda's frantic sobs. Blood spilled onto the ground, staining the dirt as Carl straightened, his chest heaving slightly but his expression unchanged. Carl wiped the blade on the grass, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Take them," he ordered his men, motioning toward the two writhing men on the ground. "Clean them up and leave them at the nearest hospital. Alive." His gaze turned to Linda, who was now on her knees, shaking and weeping uncontrollably. "You," Carl said, his voice icy and sharp, "aren't going to walk away either. But first, you're going to see what happens when you cross the wrong man." Carl stood over trembling Linda, his machete dripping crimson onto the dry, cracked earth beneath him. His face was eerily calm, his cold gaze piercing through Linda's tear-filled, panicked eyes. She tried to shuffle backward on the ground, her breath coming in ragged gasps, but the pain rendered her movements feeble and futile. "Oh, Linda," Carl said, his voice laced with mock sympathy as he tilted his head slightly. "I made a mistake. You see, I thought chopping off their balls would be enough. But then I realized I did it wrong." Linda's face contorted in confusion and terror, her lips trembling as she tried to plead, but the words caught in her throat. Carl stepped closer, towering over her like a shadow of doom. He leaned down, his face inches from hers, and whispered in a low, chilling tone, "I was supposed to chop yours." The realization hit Linda like a freight train. Her scream pierced the air as Carl moved with the precision of a predator, raising the machete and slicing through her body with brutal swiftness. Blood splattered across the dirt as Linda collapsed to the ground, clutching at her chest and writhing in unimaginable agony. Her screams echoed through the desolate clearing, raw and primal. Carl stood over her, his chest heaving slightly but his expression unyielding. He watched as Linda convulsed on the ground, tears streaming down her face, her voice hoarse from screaming. "Now you know," Carl said, his voice devoid of emotion. "Now you know what real, physical pain feels like. The kind of pain you've inflicted on others with your lies, your schemes, and your betrayal." The clearing fell silent for a moment, save for Linda's ragged cries. Carl wiped the machete clean on the hem of his shirt, his movements methodical. He turned to his men, who stood silently, their expressions grim but resolute. "You know why we call this the spot, Linda?" Carl asked, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. Linda could barely lift her head, her face twisted in anguish, but she managed to let out a weak, gasping sound as if trying to respond. Carl smirked darkly, his eyes scanning the horizon. "Because it's where we feed the jackals and coyotes." As if summoned by his words, the first shadowy forms began to appear at the edge of the clearing. The scavengers came cautiously at first, their eyes glinting in the moonlight, their noses sniffing the blood-soaked air. More and more emerged from the darkness, their low growls and yips building into a cacophony of hunger and anticipation. Carl turned to his men, jerking his head toward their vehicles. "We're done here," he said coldly. "Let nature take its course." The group began to retreat, leaving the clearing behind as the scavengers grew bolder, moving in on their helpless prey. Linda's sobs mixed with the snarls and growls of the approaching animals, the horrifying sounds fading into the night as Carl and his crew disappeared into the darkness, leaving behind a scene of brutal reckoning. The sterile hospital room was quiet except for the steady beeping of the heart monitor and the faint hum of fluorescent lights. John lay on the bed, his face pale but calm as a uniformed officer delivered the grim news. "We found remains near the border," the officer said, his voice professional but detached. "The victims, your wife and 2 other men, appear to have been attacked by animals. There's little doubt it was a gruesome end." He paused, studying John for a reaction. "We'll be closing the case unless further evidence arises." John nodded slowly, murmuring his thanks as the officer left. He turned his head toward Carl, who was sitting silently in the chair by the window, staring out at the hospital parking lot. "Carl," John said softly, his voice weak but steady. "Was it you?" Carl didn't look at his brother immediately. He continued staring out the window for a few moments, the light casting shadows across his face. Then, with a shrug, he finally turned to face John, his expression unreadable. "I have no clue what happened to Linda," Carl said evenly, his lips twitching slightly at the corners. John couldn't help but let out a dry chuckle, the faintest trace of relief mingling with the lingering pain in his eyes. Carl caught his brother's look and allowed himself a faint smile, one filled with unspoken truths and brotherly understanding. Carl rose from his seat, stretching his arms before adjusting his jacket. He glanced back at John, his smirk turning into something softer. "You know," he said, his voice carrying a hint of humor, "I just saved you a lot of legal fees." John laughed weakly, shaking his head. "You're something else, Carl." Carl moved toward the door, his boots echoing on the tile floor. Just as he reached the doorway, he stopped, turning halfway to look back at his brother. "I need to go away for a while, John. My old life is calling me back. No matter how much I try to leave it behind, something always sends me back." "Carl, wait," John began, but his brother raised a hand to silence him. "You take care of yourself and the boys," Carl said, his voice low and firm. That's all that matters now. Without another word, Carl walked out of the hospital room, leaving John alone with his thoughts. Outside, the scene was different. A group of men, Carl's old crew, stood waiting. Their presence was imposing, their faces etched with loyalty and respect. One of them stepped forward, carrying a sleek black suit with an intricate red dragon embroidered on the back. Carl stopped, his eyes scanning the suit before taking it in his hands. A small, wry smile played on his lips as he held it up, the dragon shimmering in the sunlight. He slipped the jacket on, the weight of it familiar and comfortable, as though he were stepping back into a role he had once mastered. The men nodded approvingly, their silent gestures speaking louder than words. Carl adjusted the cuffs of his jacket, exuding an air of authority that demanded respect. He turned to his crew, his eyes sharp and determined. "Let's get to work," Carl said simply. The group moved as one, a quiet but powerful force, as they left the hospital grounds. Behind them, the faint echo of their footsteps lingered, a reminder that Carl Griffin, once a man seeking redemption, had embraced the shadows once more. Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments section below and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.